Church looked smaller than I remembered. I sat in my car for a long time before I went in, not because I was nervous, more because I wasn't sure what I was supposed to feel. My hands were folded in my lap, and I kept noticing the arthritis in my left knuckle, the way it's been swollen since February. Little things like that have a way of anchoring you when everything else feels like it's drifting. My daughter was getting married that afternoon, and she had asked me not to sit in the front row. She hadn't said it cruelly. That's the part that still catches me even now. She said it the way you'd ask someone to keep the noise down. Polite, matter of fact, like she was telling me the dress code or the parking situation. "Mom," she said, "Marcus's family is they're used to a certain kind of thing. I just think it would be easier if you sat somewhere in the middle. You know how you get emotional. I don't want the photos to be." She stopped herself, took a breath. "I just think it would be better." I said, "Okay." I said it before I even knew I'd said it. That was 3 weeks before the wedding. I should back up, because none of this makes sense without the before. I grew up in Sudbury. My father worked at the nickel smelter most of his life, and my mother cleaned houses on the West End until her back gave out. We weren't people who talked much about feelings. You got up, you made the porridge, you went to school, and you didn't ask for things you knew you couldn't have. That was the texture of my childhood. Not cruel, just practical. I had my daughter, I'll call her that, my daughter, when I was 26. Her father and I were married in a small ceremony at City Hall. Witnesses were my cousin and a woman from his work whose name I can never remember. We didn't have money for much else. When the marriage ended, 9 years later, I was the one who stayed. In the house, with her, with the van that needed new brake pads every other year, with the OSAP forms I filled out at the kitchen table 3 years in a row because her school kept changing something. I worked at the school board for 22 years, not teaching. I was in the administration office, attendance records, scheduling, the kind of work that keeps everything running but that nobody sees. I liked it. I liked knowing where everyone was supposed to be. I was good at keeping track of things. My daughter was bright. She always had been, the kind of child who reads the instructions before she opens the box, methodical. She made lists the way other kids made messes. In grade 9, she had a binder for each subject with color-coded tabs, and she kept them in the same order on her shelf from September to June. I was proud of her. I still am. That's not a simple thing to say, but it's true. She got a scholarship to Western. I drove her to London with everything packed in the van, her duvet, her printer, a rice cooker she'd never learned to use. We cried in the parking lot, both of us. She called me every Sunday for the first year. Then less again. I told myself that was normal. I'd read enough about it. Children grow, they build new lives. The distance isn't rejection, it's just growth. I believe that, mostly. She met Marcus in her second year of her master's program. He was finishing a law degree. His family was from West Ottawa, Old Ottawa, as people sometimes say it, though I've never fully understood what that means, except that it seems to mean something to the people who say it. His mother wore her silver hair in a way that looked expensive. His father had the handshake of a man who expected things to go his way. I met them once before the engagement. A dinner at a restaurant on Elgin Street where the menu didn't have prices, and I spent the first 20 minutes trying to figure out what was appropriate to order. His mother talked about their place in the Gatineau Hills. His father talked about a trip they'd taken to Portugal. I talked about the new Tim Hortons they'd put in near my neighborhood and then wished I hadn't. My daughter laughed a little too loudly at something his mother said, and I watched her from across the table and thought, she's performing, she's very good at it. After the engagement, the calls dropped to once every few weeks. I told myself it was the planning. Weddings are complicated. There's a lot to organize. I'd helped where I could, offered to address envelopes, offered to look after the out-of-town guests. She said they had it covered. In January, she called to tell me about the seating. She talked for a long time before she got to the point, about the venue and the flowers and the photographer, a woman from Kingston who was apparently very sought after. And then, almost at the end, she said it. The middle of the church. Somewhere in the middle would be better, Mom. Marcus's family will be in the front. His aunts and everyone. There's a lot of them. I said, okay. Then she said the other part. The part about the photos. About how I got emotional. About how it would just be easier. I said, okay, again. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. My tea went cold. The fridge made its usual sound. A car alarm went off somewhere on the street and then stopped. I thought about the school year I worked 2 jobs, the board during the day, data entry 3 evenings a week, so she could take the trip to Costa Rica with her geography class. I thought about the year I didn't replace my winter coat because she needed new textbooks. I thought about the Sunday mornings when she was 11 and we'd drive out to Killarney because she loved the pink granite, and she'd run ahead on the trail, and I'd watch her and feel something so large and clean in my chest I didn't have a word for it. I thought about her wedding dress, which I had not been asked to help choose. I thought about my seat in the middle of the church. I didn't cry. I noticed that. I thought I would, but I didn't. I have a friend, my closest friend really, who I've known since we were both young mothers in the same neighborhood on the edge of town. She lost her husband 7 years ago, and she has 3 grown children, 2 of whom call her mostly when they need something notarized or when they're fighting with each other and want someone to adjudicate. We've talked about this, she and I, over so many coffees I've lost count. How you give, and you tell yourself it's not transactional, it's love, you don't keep score. And then one day you realize you've been keeping score the whole time, you just stopped looking at the tally. She was the one who asked me what I was going to do. I said I was going to go to the wedding. Of course I was going to go. She said, obviously, but what are you going to do? I didn't answer right away. I was looking out her window at the bird feeder she keeps topped up even in January. A chickadee was hanging upside down from it, doing that thing they do. I said, I'm going to sit where I want to sit. She looked at me and nodded slowly, then she poured more coffee. I want to be honest about what happened inside me between January and May. I didn't confront my daughter. I thought about it many times. I drafted conversations in my head while I was falling asleep, all the things I could say, all the things she should hear. I had the full script ready. I knew every word. But every time I picked up the phone, I thought about her voice on the other end, that careful, managed voice she'd developed, the one that was very good at making you feel unreasonable for having feelings, and I put the phone back down. I am 63 years old. I have spent most of my life being reasonable, being accommodating, being the person who says okay when okay is the last thing I mean. I'm not looking for sympathy. I'm just telling you what was true. In March, I had a conversation with my lawyer. I had been meaning to do this for a while anyway, update my will, make sure everything was in order. When you get to a certain age, you stop putting those things off. My estate isn't complicated. The house in Sudbury, which I still own, it's rented out now. The RRSP, a small savings account I've been adding to since my daughter was in diapers. I'd always assumed everything would go to her. That was the plan. That had always been the plan. Sitting in my lawyer's office with the paperwork in front of me, I looked at her name on the form and I thought about the phone call in January and the seat in the middle of the church. I changed some things, not out of anger, or not only anger, more because it was the first time in a long time that I had done something that was entirely for me, a decision that nobody else had a vote on, that nobody else even had to know about. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in months. The wedding was on a Saturday in May, unseasonably warm, the kind of day that people say is perfect for a wedding, and it was, objectively. The sky was that particular blue that only happens in May in Ontario. The lilacs were still out. The church was a 140-year-old limestone building on the edge of the glebe that his family had attended for generations. I wore a navy dress I'd bought at a small shop on Bank Street, sensible heels I could actually walk in, a brooch that had belonged to my mother, a small pearl thing she'd worn to church every Sunday. I looked fine. I looked appropriate. I looked like someone's mother, which I am. I arrived early, earlier than almost anyone. And I walked to the third pew from the front, on the left side, and I sat down. I want to be clear about why. It wasn't to cause a scene. It wasn't to embarrass anyone. I had no interest in making her day difficult. That was never what this was about. I sat in the third pew because I had driven 9 hours from Sudbury, and I had worked 2 jobs and skipped winter coats and driven to Killarney on Sunday mornings, and I was her mother, and I wanted to see her face when she came through those doors. That was the whole of it. An usher came over, a young man, maybe 22, nervous in his rented suit. He asked if I was family of the bride or the groom. I said the bride. He said, gesturing carefully toward the middle of the church, "The bride's family is seated." I said, "I know," I said it gently. I said, "I'm her mother. I'll be sitting here." He didn't know what to do with that. He moved on. Marcus's mother arrived and was seated in the first pew with a quiet efficiency that suggested she'd always known exactly where she was going to sit. She glanced at me once, briefly. I nodded. She looked away. When my daughter came through the doors on her father's arm, her father, who had not driven 9 hours, who had not filled out the OSAP forms, but who was standing in the position of honor because that's how the choreography works, I saw her face before she saw me. She was luminous. She was genuinely, heartbreakingly beautiful. The dress was ivory, simple, exactly right for her. Her hair was pinned up with a few pieces left loose at her jaw. Then she saw me. Something moved across her face. It was fast. She controlled it quickly, the way she controls everything. But I saw it, something between surprise and something else I couldn't quite name. Not anger, more like recognition, like she had known somewhere underneath all the careful planning that I would be here, that I would always be here. She looked at me for a second that felt much longer than a second. Then she looked forward, toward Marcus, waiting at the altar. And she walked on. I will say this, it was a beautiful ceremony. The officiant was warm without being cloying. The vows were personal. They'd written their own, and Marcus's were better than I expected. He looked at her the way you want someone to look at your child, like she was something he intended to take care of. I cried during the vows. Of course I did. The woman beside me, one of Marcus's aunts, who turned out to be from Pembroke and had opinions about the highway construction on the 417, passed me a tissue without being asked, and we smiled at each other in the way that women of a certain age smile at each other, which is a whole conversation compressed into a moment. At the reception, I was seated at a table near the back with some of her colleagues from the university and a couple who'd driven in from Halifax. It was fine. The food was good. The speeches were long. My daughter danced her first dance with Marcus to a song I didn't recognize, and I watched from my table, and I felt something very complicated that I don't have a single word for: pride, loss. The particular loneliness of loving someone who has outgrown the shape of your life. She came to my table once, briefly, during the cocktail hour. She squeezed my hand. She said, "I'm glad you're here, Mom." I said, "I know you are." It wasn't everything I wanted to say, but it was true. We haven't talked directly about the phone call. We haven't talked about the third pew. I don't know if we will. What I know is this: something shifted. Not dramatically. Not in a way that anyone watching would have noticed. But she calls more now. The calls are different. More careful, maybe, or more honest. I'm still figuring out which. She asked me recently what I'd been doing, and I told her about the long weekend I'd spent at a little inn near Tobermory, walking the trails, eating breakfast by myself with a book. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That sounds really nice, Mom." I think it surprised her that I had somewhere to be. My friend and I have coffee on Thursday mornings. We talk about our children the way you talk about weather. You can't control it. You can't stop watching it, and sometimes it's exactly what you hoped for, and sometimes it isn't. The bird feeder is full. The chickadees are still doing that thing they do. I updated the will again last month. Added a small bequest to the hospice in Sudbury where my mother spent her final weeks. Added something for the granddaughter of a woman I worked with for 12 years who is going to university in the fall and whose family is working very hard to make it happen. I didn't tell my daughter about any of that. It didn't seem necessary. What I've come to understand, sitting in my kitchen with my cold tea and my swollen knuckle and the sound of the street outside, is that love isn't the same as availability. For a long time I treated them as synonyms. I was there, so I loved. I gave, so I loved. I said okay when I meant the opposite, and I told myself that was love. I'm not sure anymore. I know I sat in the third pew and watched her walk toward her life, and she was beautiful, and I was glad. I know that on the drive home I stopped at a rest stop north of Barrie and stood outside in the dark for a while and looked at the sky, which was very clear and full of stars, the kind of sky you forget exists until you're away from city lights. I stood there for a long time. Then I got back in the car and drove home. I've been thinking about cause and effect a lot lately. Not in any dramatic way, just the quiet kind of thinking you do when you're washing dishes and the radio is on and you're not really listening to either. What I keep coming back to is this: the way my daughter treated me on that phone call in January wasn't something that happened out of nowhere. It was the end of a long chain of small moments, moments where I said okay when I meant no, where I made myself smaller so she could feel bigger, where I taught her, without meaning to, that I didn't have a bottom line. You teach people how to treat you. I'd read that somewhere and dismissed it as a bumper sticker. Now I think it might be one of the truest things I know. And here's what I didn't understand for a long time: love without self-respect isn't actually love. It's just fear wearing love's clothing. I was afraid that if I pushed back, if I took up space, if I said what I actually meant, she would love me less. So I kept giving, and the giving became expected, and the expected became invisible. And somewhere in there, I became invisible too. Sitting in that third pew, I did something I hadn't done in years. I thought clearly, not emotionally, not reactively, clearly. I thought, I have earned this seat. I have a right to witness this moment. And the clarity of that thought felt like something waking up in me that had been asleep for a very long time. That's the thing about integrity, the real kind, the kind that doesn't perform itself for anyone. It doesn't announce itself. It just acts. It gets up, drives 9 hours, walks into a limestone church on a blue May morning, and sits down in the third pew. No speech, no confrontation, just the quiet dignity of a person who knows what she's worth. And it turns out that quiet dignity communicates more than any argument I could have had on the phone. My daughter saw me sitting there, and something passed between us that we still haven't fully talked about, but that we both know happened. You can't unsee a person choosing themselves, especially when that person is your mother. I think about the version of me that stayed home that day, that said okay one more time, drove to my friend's place and watched the hours go by. And I think that version of me would have lost something that couldn't be recovered, not just my seat at her wedding, but the last piece of something I'd been slowly handing away for years. What I know now is that the strength to show up for yourself on your own behalf, even when it's uncomfortable, even when you haven't been invited in the way you deserved, that strength isn't stubbornness. It's the most honest form of love there is. It says, I matter, and so do you. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise, because pretending doesn't actually help either of us. I stood in a parking lot north of Barrie that night under more stars than I'd seen in years. Cold air, dead quiet, the kind of dark that only exists away from city lights. I felt like myself, fully for the first time in a long time. That's worth something. I think it might be worth everything.